Hi all, so just popping together a quick video for your composition lesson today. I thought I'd focus on development sections of sonata forms because I know that a couple of you are writing sonatas at the moment, and I think all of you have tried to write a sonata at some point in the past, so I thought it might be quite useful to do a video on this. It's also the case that I think the development section is often the most challenging bit of a sonata form. You all seem to know what you're doing for an exposition or a recapitulation, but when it comes to the development, it seems that that's the bit where you tend to get a bit more stuck, a bit more stumped. So I thought it might be nice to just try and break down what's going on in a development section. So broadly speaking, although there are several approaches to a development section, they can be kind of broken down into two sort of further sections, and that's sort of a passage of motivic development where material from the exposition is fragmented, it's juxtaposed, it's repeated in sequence, it's taken into new keys, and then a section of dominant preparation, so where we get a dominant pedal and some material kind of repeated over that dominant pedal, so that the return of the tonic is prepared when it appears in the recapitulation. Today we're going to look at a couple of examples. We're going to look at the development section from the Pathetique, and we're going to look at the development section from Beethoven's First Piano Sonata, Opus 2 No. 1, because they sort of illustrate this kind of principle quite nicely. But there are a couple of exceptions. There are some development sections that don't necessarily follow this format, and so I'll take a look through those next week. So, without further ado, here's the development section of the Pathetique Sonata. I'm just going to play that through, just so you're kind of reminded what it sounds like. And so on and so forth. Okay, so there's the development section, and we can divide that into two principal bits. So the first part, we've got some motivic development, and here Beethoven kind of alternates first subject group material, that sort of ascending theme, that ba 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 ba, which has a kind of 5-7-1 feel in the right hand because of that tritone constantly resolving kind of outwards, and then the tritone resolving inwards throughout those two bars. And then that's interspersed with material from the intro. So it's like a little fragment of material from the intro. The bit that we usually go ba 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 ba, but here it's ba 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 da 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 da. So we've got those two fragments, and they're kind of really rapidly juxtaposed there. It's also worth stating that we've started in E minor, which is kind of a relatively distant, it's the relative minor of the dominant. It's a relatively distant key from the tonic. But we have kind of started immediately on that key. We've had a recap of the introduction that's sort of helped us modulate to that key, but it's sort of bang straight into a new key at the beginning of the development. So it's not that necessarily the development is where you might sort of modulate away from the tonic. By the time you start the development, you're probably already in a new key. Also worth noticing these kind of descending sequences. So you've got you can sort of see it more clearly in the bass, but you've got this E in the bass, and then that falls down through E flat to D, and then through D flat to C. And then that chromatic descent sort of moves into the right hand, so we get sort of B flat, moving down to A flat, down to G, then through F, E, D flat, C, and so on and so forth, until we land on this sort of E flat D thing, which is essentially a sort of a 2B chord. It has this sort of diminished seventh flavour because of that E flat with the F sharp in the bass, and it's effectively doing this. So this is the diminished seventh that Beethoven's playing with, which in the actual score it's just this F sharp to E. But if we were going to write out the full diminished seventh implied by that, it would be F sharp A C and E flat, and that if we think of our diminished sevenths as a dominant seventh minor flat 9 chord, but without the root, then this is effectively a D7 flat 9 chord. So it's the dominant of the dominant, and so this chord helps propel us into our section of dominant preparation. So that's what's going on here. The section that sort of begins with this weird kind of chromatic figure. Which is kind of made up of sort of neighbour tones of a 5/7 chord. So here's our 5/7 chord, and everything's sort of made up of kind of notes that are sit around that chord, and that's interspersed with some first subject group material. But also notice that we've got this dominant pedal all the way through the section. All the way through until we land on a 5/7 chord in the last bar of the penultimate line, and that leads to a big run that takes us all the way into the recapitulation. So broadly speaking, we've got these two sections. We've got some motivic development where we've got the first subject interspersed with the introduction in a very sort of fragmented way, and that's kind of structured around a descending sequence really. And then that lands on a 2/7B chord in a sort of diminished seventh form before we get some dominant preparation, which leads us into the return of the main theme in the recapitulation there. So that's what's going on there. I'll just very quickly take you through now to the Motivic to the development section of Beethoven Opus 2 number 1. So I'll play that through for you, although it actually might be worth listening to the whole movement. There are plenty of recordings on YouTube, so I'm sure you'll be able to find one. I'm sure you don't struggle finding recordings. So anyway, I'll play through the developments now just so you know what it sounds like and you've got a ready reference. But yes, do listen to the whole movement if you get a chance. Right, here's the development. So there was the development and the beginning of the recapitulation as well. So again, it sort of follows those two sections. We've got the Motivic development on the screen here now. So we start off in A flat major, the relative major of the tonic, of the tonic F minor, and again, it's worth noting that we're just starting dead on A flat major here. We're not trying to modulate at the beginning of the development. We're just starting in a new key, and we're using some first subject group material, this sort of ascending broken chord, and with the twiddle at the end, and we've also got some second subject group material, which happens later, this sort of descending figure. So Beethoven focuses principally on that second subject group material. It's repeated in sequence, so we get it sort of 3 times, and then we go sort of up a step in the right hand, and then it switches to the left hand, and we sort of go down a tone and down another tone, and then we get this sort of quite sort of strange syncopated passage, which kind of breaks down. It's very difficult to kind of align that with a particular bit of thematic material. It's really just kind of figuration there. It's very difficult to, it's almost like the motifs have deteriorated to a point where we can't recognise them. And that leads quite nicely then into our dominant preparation. We do get a sort of a dominant of the dominant. So the last bar in this example here, we've got this chord, which is a diminished seventh, and in the same way that the diminished seventh from the Opus 13 piano sonata was effectively a chord 2, a kind of dominant of the dominant chord, that's exactly what's going on here. This is a diminished seventh that would be based on a G7 flat 9 chord. So that's going to lead us really nicely into our dominant preparation, which is based on C. It's based on the dominant note C, so we've got this C pedal running all the way through this section. And here we've definitely got much more of the first subject group material. So whilst we had the second subject group being developed in our Motivic development, now we've moved on, and it's principally the sort of the twiddle at the end of the first subject group that gets developed there. That kind of thing. So we can see that in the right hand here, and that carries on, and it's quite good. We kind of get this sort of, it is really quite repetitive. We get this sort of kind of these octave figures, this F down to E, down to D flat, down to C, that we get twice, and we sort of get this sort of constant kind of trill figure as well. We then, right at the very end, so the last bar of the development is bar 100 here, and we end up with this very weak perfect cadence in F minor. So I say weak perfect cadence because the dominant chord is inverted. We have a 5-7 C chord in in F minor. In fairness, actually, it's that 5-7 C. You could quite happily argue that it's really just a 7B chord, and it's very weak, that perfect cadence. The dominant flavour is there, but because we don't have the dominant chord in root position and then the tonic chord in root position, it's not a strong perfect cadence. Because the dominant chord is in an inversion, we say that the perfect cadence is weaker. And so actually that gives us a bit of, through the weak recapitulation that follows, that sort of spurs us on. We need to find a strong perfect cadence to really bring the movement to a close. So anyway, those are the two development sections that we're looking at, or that we've looked at. So what could you do then if you're writing a development section? Well, it might be worth thinking then in terms of these two subsections, taking a larger section and breaking it down into two smaller sections, is potentially a little bit, makes the task a little easier. You know, dividing it into smaller chunks is a lot more helpful, especially if you already know that the second of those chunks is going to be based on a dominant pedal. You've already got part of your material ready to go. You just need to work out how you're going to articulate that dominant pedal, and also knowing that the other section, or in fact, well, both sections are going to be making use of fragments of your exposition material that you might repeat in sequence, you might rapidly juxtapose them, you might start that section somewhere distant to the tonic, and then eventually try to land on a 2/7 chord. So the dominant or the dominant at the end of the motivic development. Not only does that give you the tools with which to build that bit of development, but it also gives you a goal. You've got to land on the dominant of the dominant so that you your dominant pedal is prepared, and then that should hopefully nicely lead into your recapitulation. Right, well, I hope that's helpful. If you want me to do a video on another topic, or like a question that you have, or maybe a compositional thing that you're struggling with, then do let me know. And I'm quite happy to sort of try to piece these things together. Next week I'll maybe have a look at some of these exceptions to a kind of motivic development dominant preparation structure that you sometimes get in development sections. So yeah, cheers, and yeah, bye.